The moment she struck the flint and steel in the forbidden hall, the great house held its breath. For 100 years, the grand hearth of Blackwood Manor had been a black, hollow mouth, choked with the soot of a dead fire. Sable was merely a hired cataloger of books, a girl dismissed by the world as plain and uninspired, a ghost meant to move through the halls unnoticed. He was Lord Alaric, the master of the manor, a man whose heart was said to be as cool and silent as the stones of his home. The servants whispered that to light a fire in that hearth was to summon death itself. But what no one knew was that Sable was not afraid of the cold, and she was tired of being invisible. If you believe that the quietest person in the room can hold the most transformative power, type warmth below, and let me tell you what happened next. To understand how she got there, you need to know that Sable had nowhere else to go. She was a restorer of books, or she had been. Her hands, nimble and precise, knew the language of brittle paper and faded ink. She could stitch a spine and mend a tear in vellum so skillfully, it was as if the wound had never been. But her master, a celebrated artisan named Mr. Albright, had taken the credit for her finest work before dismissing her. He had looked at her plain face and her quiet manner and declared she lacked the fire of the soul necessary for true artistry. So she had taken a position at Blackwood Manor, a place spoken of only in hushed tones. The wages were a lifeline she could not refuse. The housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a woman who seemed carved from the same granite as the manor itself, had hired her to catalogue the vast, decaying library. The rules were simple and absolute. She was to work from dawn until dusk. She was not to wander. And she was never, under any circumstances, to enter the grand hall or speak to the master if she should happen to see him. "He values his solitude above all else," Mrs. Gable had stated, her voice leaving no room for questions. "You are here to work on the books. You are furniture that moves. See that you remember it." And Sable had. For weeks, she had been a ghost in the library, a sprawling two-story cathedral of forgotten words. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light that pierced the gloom, illuminating shelves that groaned under the weight of centuries. The scent of old paper, leather, and decay was thick in the air, a perfume she found more comforting than any flower. She never saw Lord Alaric, but she felt him. She felt him in the profound, unnatural chill that clung to the west wing, a cold that had nothing to do with the season. She felt him in the way the shadows in the corners of the library seemed to deepen and pool when evening fell, sometimes seeming to shift and stretch when she wasn't looking directly at them. The candles on her work table would gutter and dim for no reason, as if a breath had passed over them, though the air was utterly still. The servants were terrified of him. They spoke of his unnerving stillness. The way he could stand in a room so silently, he seemed to be part of the architecture. They spoke of his eyes, which they said were not black, but a deep, impossible crimson in the right light. They said he never ate, never slept, never aged. Sable listened to their stories and said nothing. She was used to being overlooked. She simply did her work, her small, competent hands bringing order to the chaos of the library. She found first editions bound in human skin and celestial maps drawn on star charts of impossible antiquity. It was a treasure trove, and the work soothed the ache of Mr. Albright's dismissal. Here, alone with the books, her skill mattered, even if only to herself. Then the winter storm had descended. It came without warning, a furious blizzard that buried the world in white and clawed at the manor with shrieking winds. The cold was a physical entity. It seeped through the thick stone walls, through the leaded glass of the windows, The small fire in the library grate sputtered and shrank, offering little more than a flicker of light against the oppressive, bone-deep chill. Sable's fingers grew stiff and clumsy. She fumbled a delicate page, nearly tearing it. Frustration, sharp and hot, pricked at her. How could she work if she could not feel her own hands? She fed the last of her firewood ration into the grate, but it was like offering a cup of water to a desert. The cold was winning. It was driving her from her sanctuary. She paced the library, hugging her thin shawl around her shoulders, her breath pluming in the air. The door to the grand hall stood at the far end of the room. It was a massive thing of dark, polished oak, and it was forbidden. But the cold was a tyrant, and Sable had a spark of rebellion in her that Mr. Albright had never seen. She thought of the grand hearth. She had only glimpsed it once, a cavernous fireplace tall enough for a man to stand in. It was a thing of legend in the household, the cold, dead heart of the manor. A reckless thought took root. A fire in that hearth would warm the entire central wing of the house. It would drive back the monstrous cold. Mrs. Gable's warning echoed in her mind. To light a fire in that hearth is to summon death itself. But what was this freezing, silent existence if not a kind of death? Driven by a primal need for warmth, she walked to the oak door. Her hand hesitated on the cold iron handle. Then she turned it. The door swung inward with a low groan, opening into a vast, echoing darkness. The grand hall was a place of shadows and ghosts. Moonlight, filtered through the towering, frost-rimmed windows, painted the marble floors in shades of silver and gray. Tapestries depicting ancient battles and forgotten kings hung like shrouds on the walls, their colors faded to monochrome. And there, dominating the far wall, was the hearth. It was even larger than she had imagined. A monolithic structure of black stone, carved with grim, unsmiling faces and coiling serpents. The air around it was colder than anywhere else in the house, a pocket of absolute frost. Soot coated every surface. Sable was not a maid used to fires. She was a restorer. She looked at the hearth not with superstitious fear, but with a practical eye. She saw the thick, greasy buildup of creosote. She saw the way the chimney throat narrowed abruptly. It wasn't cursed. It was simply poorly maintained. A blocked flue. She returned to the library and gathered her tools, not for books, but for this new task. A long-handled brush she used for dusting high shelves, a metal ruler, a small, sharp knife. Back in the hall, she found a dusty pile of discarded kindling and a few dry logs in a forgotten brass bin, left there a century ago. Tucked behind them, her fingers brushed against a small leather pouch. Inside were a flint and a piece of steel. Working with a focused intensity she usually reserved for priceless manuscripts, she began to clean the hearth. She used the ruler to scrape away the worst of the soot at the opening of the flue. A thick, black shower of debris fell into the fireplace. She worked the long-handled brush up into the chimney, dislodging a dense blockage, likely an old bird's nest. More soot and twigs tumbled down. Her face was smudged, her hands were black, but a channel was clear. She could feel a faint draft, a whisper of air from above. She laid the fire with the same precision she would use to set a book in a press. Kindling first, a lattice of dry twigs. Then the smaller logs, arranged to allow the air to circulate. Finally, the two largest logs on top. She knelt on the cold marble. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. This was the true transgression. This was the act from which there was no return. She took the flint and steel, Her hands were steady. She struck them together. Once, twice. A spark flew, dying on the cold stone. She adjusted her angle, her movements economical and sure. She struck again. A bright hot spark landed in the heart of the tinder. A tiny wisp of smoke curled upwards. A small, hesitant flame flickered to life, orange and beautiful in the profound dark. It licked at the kindling, tasted it, and grew bolder. The flame caught, spread, and with a sudden, soft whoosh, the fire roared to life. Flames leaped up the newly cleared chimney, devouring the logs. Golden light and impossible warmth flooded the grand hall. The shadows, which had clung to the corners like ancient beasts, recoiled, shrinking back into the recesses. The tapestries seemed to regain a hint of their color. The air, once frigid, was now filled with the scent of pine smoke and the crackle of a living fire. For the first time in 100 years, the heart of Blackwood Manor was beating. Sable sat back on her heels, mesmerized. She had done it. She had brought warmth and light into the darkness. A fierce, quiet pride swelled in her chest, and that was when she felt it, the cold. It was a presence behind her, a drop in temperature so profound, so absolute. It was as if a door to the frozen outdoors had been thrown open. The roaring fire seemed to offer no protection against it. The cheerful crackling of the logs sounded suddenly fragile. She did not need to turn. She knew. A shadow fell over her, long and sharp in the firelight. It detached itself from the deeper darkness of the archway leading to the west wing. "What have you done?" The voice was not loud, but it filled the vast hall. It was a voice like midnight frost and old stone, a voice that had not been used for conversation in a very long time. It held no anger. It held something far more terrifying, a deep, resonant shock. Slowly, Sable pushed herself to her feet and turned to face the master of the house. Lord Alaric was exactly as the whispers had described, and yet so much more. He was impossibly tall and still, not the stillness of a man holding his breath, but the stillness of a statue, of something that did not need to breathe at all. He wore a coat of black velvet that seemed to drink the firelight. His face was a mask of aristocratic beauty, all sharp angles and pale, flawless skin. And his eyes. The servants had been wrong. They were not merely crimson. They were the color of dying embers, of embers that could flare back to life in an instant. They were fixed on her, and in their depths, she saw a century of winter. She should have been terrified. She should have stammered an apology, begged for forgiveness. But looking at him, she felt a strange and sudden calm. She saw the shock in his ancient eyes, but beneath it, she saw a flicker of something else. A stunned, raw disbelief. She simply answered his question. Her voice was quiet, but it did not tremble. "I was cold." He took a step toward her, his movement utterly silent. The air around him shimmered with the cold he carried. The shadows at his feet seemed to flow like liquid, pooling and stretching with a life of their own. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze dropping from her face to the roaring fire, and then back to her. He was looking at her, truly looking at her, in a way no one ever had, not at her plain dress or the soot on her cheek. He was looking at her as if she were a phenomenon, an impossibility made real. The sound of footsteps, sharp and panicked, echoed from the corridor. Mrs. Gable appeared, her face a mask of horror. She saw Sable, the fire, and the master, and her hand flew to her mouth. "My lord, I am so sorry. This girl, she will be dismissed at once. She will be thrown out. No! The word was absolute. It cut through the housekeeper's frantic apology like a shard of ice. Mrs. Gable froze, her mouth slightly agape. Lord Alaric did not take his eyes off Sable. She stays. He made a small, dismissive gesture with one long-fingered hand. Leave us. Mrs. Gable looked from her master to Sable, her expression a mixture of terror and utter confusion. But she did not dare to disobey. She gave a stiff, jerky curtsy and practically fled from the hall. Silence descended again, thick and heavy, broken only by the crackling of the fire. You were cold, he repeated, his voice softer now, a low murmur. It was not a question. It was a statement he was trying to understand. Yes, Sable said. My hands were too stiff to work. The library fire was not enough. She gestured to the hearth. The flue was blocked. I cleared it. He stared at her, and for the first time in a century, the Vampire King felt something other than the endless, gnawing chill. He felt curiosity. This small, plain creature was not afraid of him. She had faced the legendary cold of his hall, the spectral dread that kept his entire staff at bay, and had diagnosed it as a blocked flue. She had met the darkness not with prayers or terror, but with a brush and a steady hand. Your work is no longer in the library, he said. It was not a request. It was a decree. Sable's heart sank. He was dismissing her from her sanctuary, from the books she had come to love. My lord? Your new work is here. He gestured to the fire. You will tend this hearth. You will ensure it never goes out. She stared at him, bewildered. Tend the fire. But anyone can do that. The footmen, the maids. No, he said, and the word held an ancient finality. Only you. He looked into her eyes, and she felt the weight of his gaze, a pressure that was both intimate and immense. You will move your belongings to the Rosewood Suite, in the East Wing. Sable knew of the Rosewood Suite. It was a set of rooms adjoining the master's private wing, rooms that had been sealed for generations. To be moved, there was not just a change of station. It was an act of claiming. She was being brought into the very heart of his frozen world. She had no choice, and she knew it. But as she looked at the magnificent, impossible man before her, and the beautiful, living fire she had created, she found she did not want one. As you wish, my lord, she whispered. And so began her new life. She was no longer Sable, the invisible book restorer. She was the keeper of the flame. Her only duty was the great hearth in the grand hall. The other servants now looked at her with a mixture of awe and fear. She was the girl who had done the impossible and survived. She had been claimed by the master. She moved into the Rosewood Suite, a set of rooms that were the opposite of her former garret. They were filled with furniture shrouded in white cloths, like sleeping ghosts. The air was thick with the scent of dried roses and dust. But the rooms were not cold. A small fire had already been laid in her private sitting room, a silent order from the master. Her days fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. Her nights, however, belonged to him. Every evening, as dusk bled across the sky, she would go to the grand hall. She would check the fire, add new logs, and sweep the hearth. And every evening, he would appear. He would emerge from the shadows and take his seat in a massive, high-backed chair carved from black oak, positioned just outside the main circle of the fire's light. He would sit there for hours, utterly motionless, watching the flames. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a constant, brooding weight. Sable learned the contours of his silence. She learned to feel the subtle shifts in the atmosphere that signaled his moods. She could feel his attention on her as she worked, a palpable, unnerving focus. For weeks, this was their only interaction, the silent master and the quiet keeper. The rest of the house seemed to hold its breath around them. The unnatural chill in the manor had receded, replaced by the gentle, pervasive warmth of the great fire. The servants whispered that the house itself felt happier. Sable, however, was filled with questions. Why her? Why was this fire so important? One night, her curiosity finally outweighed her caution. She had just added a large log of fragrant pine to the fire, sending a shower of sparks dancing up the chimney. He was in his chair, a silhouette against the deeper darkness. "My lord," she began, her voice soft. "Why me? Any servant could be taught to tend a fire." The silence stretched. She thought he would not answer. Then his voice emerged from the shadows, low and resonant. "They could be taught, but they would not succeed. They are afraid." "Afraid of you?" she asked, her boldness surprising her. "Of the cold," he corrected gently. "Of the dark. Of the stories they tell themselves about this place. They fear the heart of the house. You saw a blocked chimney." He shifted, leaning forward slightly, bringing his face into the edge of the firelight. His crimson eyes glowed. "This fire is more than wood and flame, Sable. It is an anchor, a tether." He paused, and she felt he was choosing his words with immense care, pulling them from a place of deep and profound solitude. "There is a curse upon my line," he said, his voice flat, devoid of self-pity. "An ancient cold. It settles in the heart, and then the soul. For centuries, this hearth, when lit by a particular kind of hand, held the worst of it at bay. It acted as a counterbalance, a heart of fire against a heart of ice." Sable listened, her own heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm. This was the truth, then. The dark, impossible secret of Blackwood Manor. "A century ago," he continued, his gaze fixed on the flames, "the one who tended it was lost, and the fire went out. No one has been able to relight it since. I had come to believe no one ever would. The cold has had 100 years to set." He finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. "The curse requires a warm heart and a steady hand, a spirit that does not flinch from the encroaching frost. I did not believe such a person existed anymore. And then you, a girl hired to dust books, walked into the darkness and made a light." He needed her. That was the stunning, unbelievable truth. The powerful, immortal lord of the manor needed her, the plain, dismissed girl. "I need you to keep this flame alive," he said. "Not as a servant, as a custodian of this house's last hope. I will give you anything you ask. A fortune that will make you a queen in your own right. Estates, jewels, a new name, anything. You have only to ask." Sable looked at him, at this magnificent, lonely creature trapped in an eternal winter. She saw past the power and the danger to the profound solitude beneath. It was a loneliness she recognized, a feeling of being set apart and unseen. She thought of the money, the life he was offering. It was more than she could ever have dreamed of, but it was not what she wanted. "I do not want a fortune, my lord," she said quietly. He stilled. What do you want then? She took a small breath. I want to be allowed back in the library. Would you have stayed when you learned the truth of his curse? Tell me in the comments, and if you are not subscribed yet, join this family. A flicker of something, surprise, confusion, crossed his face. The library? You would trade a queen's ransom for access to a dusty room? The books are my work, she said simply. It is what I do. It is who I am. I will tend your fire. I will be its custodian. But in the daylight hours, I ask to be allowed to continue my own work. He was silent for a long time, studying her in the flickering light. He saw no cunning in her eyes, no hidden angle. He saw only a quiet, unshakable sincerity. She was not trying to leverage her position for wealth. She was asking to be allowed to be herself. It was perhaps the most unexpected request he had received in 500 years. Very well, he said at last, a strange, almost gentle tone in his voice. You may have the library. It is yours. And with that, their pact was sealed. Sable agreed to stay, not for a reward, but for a reason she was only just beginning to understand. She was a restorer, and she had just been presented with the most broken, most magnificent project of her life. Their nights continued in the grand hall, but the dynamic had shifted. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with a new, unspoken understanding. Sable, true to her word, spent her days in the library, but she did not work alone. She would bring a particularly damaged or interesting volume down to the grand hall in the evening. By the light of the great fire, she would set up a small, portable workstation on a low table. At first, he merely watched from his chair in the shadows, but her quiet competence was a mesmerizing thing to behold. Her hands moved with a surgeon's precision, cleaning away centuries of grime, mending torn pages with slivers of nearly invisible tissue, restitching a broken spine with waxed thread. One evening she was working on a medieval book of hours, its illuminated pages flaking and fragile. The pigments are unstable, she murmured, more to herself than to him. The lapis has held, but the vermilion is turning to dust. From the shadows, his voice came. It was ground too finely. The binder is failing. It is a common problem with cinnabar from that region. Sable looked up, startled. He spoke with the casual authority of someone who had been there. You know of pigments? He rose from his chair and for the first time walked into the full circle of the fire's light to stand beside her table. He leaned over, his shadow falling across her work. He pointed a long, elegant finger at a passage of text. The monk who wrote this, a brother Matteo, was notoriously impatient. He rushed his preparations. Sable stared at him. You speak as if you knew him. A faint, sad smile touched his lips, a fleeting expression that transformed his face. I did. A long, long time ago. He had a passion for gossip and a terrible singing voice. It was the first crack in the wall of his immense solitude. After that night, he began to speak more. She would ask about a book, and he would tell her its story. Not the story of its printing, but the story of its life. He had known the poets who wrote the verses, debated with the philosophers, stood beside the generals who chronicled their campaigns. He was a living library, a repository of centuries. Sable, in turn, showed him her world. She explained the chemistry of paper decay, the art of tooling leather, the delicate process of restoring gold leaf. He was a rapt audience. He was fascinated by her skill, by the quiet, focused passion she brought to her craft. For the first time in her life, Sable felt truly seen. He did not see a plain servant girl. He saw an artisan, an expert. He saw the fire of the soul that Mr. Albright had claimed she lacked. The shadows that were his constant companions began to change their behavior around her. Before, they had been a sinister, writhing presence at the edges of the room. Now they seemed calm. They would pool in the far corners, leaving the space around the hearth and her workstation clear. They treated her not as an intruder, but as a fixture, a part of their master's world. The cold that radiated from him also began to lessen when she was near. He still carried the chill of the grave, but it was no longer the aggressive, biting frost it had once been. It was the quiet cool of a deep well. One night, as a winter gale howled outside, a log on the fire shifted unexpectedly. It rolled forward, sending a cascade of glowing embers onto the priceless Aubusson rug at the foot of the hearth. Sable gasped and moved to stamp them out with her shoe, but in less than a heartbeat, he was there. He moved with a speed that was not human, a blur of black velvet. He swept her aside with one arm, shielding her body with his own, as he knelt and smothered the embers with his bare hands. The moment the danger was past, he stilled, half covering her where she had stumbled to her knees. His hand was on the floor, inches from hers. The back of his hand brushed her fingers. His skin was shockingly cold. But it was not the dead, inert cold of stone. It was vibrant, like touching a block of ice that hummed with a hidden, powerful energy. The contact sent a jolt through her, a current of pure sensation that was neither warmth nor cold, but something else entirely. He froze, his crimson eyes locking with hers. The air grew thick, charged with a sudden, potent intimacy. The howling of the wind, the crackling of the fire, it all faded away. There was only the vast, silent hall, the scent of smoke, and the feeling of his cold skin against hers. He pulled his hand back as if burned, a flicker of something raw and vulnerable in his eyes. He rose to his full, imposing height, retreating a step, putting distance between them. "You are unhurt?" he asked, his voice strained. "Yes," she whispered, her heart pounding. "Thank you." He gave a curt nod and retreated to his chair in the shadows, but the barrier between them had been irrevocably breached. The quiet companionship had been touched by something new, something fragile and dangerous and overwhelmingly real. The weeks turned into months. The fierce winter began to loosen its grip on the land. But inside the manor, a different season was dawning. The tentative trust between Sable and Alaric was beginning to blossom into a hesitant, fragile affection. He began to call her Sable, not as a designation, but as a name. She found herself looking forward to the evenings, to their quiet hours by the fire, more than she had ever looked forward to anything in her life. But the world outside the gates of Blackwood Manor had not forgotten them, and it was about to intrude. Mr. Albright, Sable's former master, had not fared well since her departure. His own work, without her meticulous skill to polish it, had been revealed as merely competent, not brilliant. His reputation was suffering. When whispers reached him of a plain, dismissed apprentice, now living in splendor as the companion of the reclusive and fabulously wealthy Lord Alaric, his professional jealousy curdled into a vicious, greedy rage. He could not fathom it. The girl had no charm, no beauty, no connections. He convinced himself that she must have stolen something from him, a rare manuscript, a secret technique, and used it to trick her way into the nobleman's favor. Or perhaps she had stumbled upon some treasure in the old manor and was manipulating the eccentric lord. Driven by a potent cocktail of greed and wounded pride, he formulated a plan. He went to the local magistrate, a pompous and ambitious man named Henderson, and spun a tale of theft and deception. He claimed that Sable, his former apprentice, had stolen priceless historical documents from his workshop and fled. He had, he said with feigned regret, tracked her to Blackwood Manor. Armed with an official-looking writ and the authority of the law, Mr. Albright and Magistrate Henderson arrived at the gates of Blackwood one crisp spring afternoon. Mrs. Gable met them at the door, her face a stony mask of disapproval. "Lord Alaric does not receive visitors," she stated flatly. "We are not visitors," Henderson puffed, flourishing the writ. "We are here on official business, to apprehend a thief." The housekeeper's eyes narrowed, but the law was the law. With visible reluctance, she led them into the grand hall. Sable was there, gently dusting the carved mantelpiece. She turned at the sound of their entry, and her heart stopped. "Mr. Albright." His face was flushed with righteous malice. He looked at her, then around the magnificent hall with its roaring fire, and his expression hardened into one of pure vindictiveness. "There she is!" he cried, pointing a trembling finger. "The thief!" Before Sable could speak, a voice flowed from the shadows near the great staircase. "You will lower your voice in my house." Lord Alaric descended the stairs. He was not dressed in his usual velvet coat, but in formal day attire that made him look less like a creature of the night and more like an immensely powerful and ancient aristocrat. The daylight from the high windows seemed to bend around him, refusing to touch him directly. The temperature in the hall dropped by several degrees. Magistrate Henderson, though visibly unnerved, stood his ground. "My lord, I am Magistrate Henderson. We have reason to believe this woman, Sable, is in possession of stolen property belonging to this gentleman, Mr. Albright." Alaric's gaze drifted to Albright, his crimson eyes flat and cold. "Is that so?" "It is," Albright insisted, emboldened by the presence of the law. He turned his venom on Sable. "I took her in out of pity. An orphan with clumsy hands and no imagination. I taught her everything she knows, and she repaid me by stealing priceless 15th-century manuscripts and fleeing in the night." He then looked at Alaric with a sycophantic sneer. "My lord, you have been deceived. She is a common fraud. She has no soul for artistry, no true skill. Whatever she has told you, whatever she has shown you, it is a lie built on what she stole from me." Sable stood frozen, the words hitting her like physical blows. It was the same dismissal, the same casual cruelty, but this time it was a public accusation. Her old wound, the one she thought had begun to heal in the warmth of the fire, was torn open anew. She felt the blood drain from her face. She looked not at her accuser, but at Alaric. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. For a terrifying moment, she wondered if he would believe them. What was her word against that of a celebrated master and an officer of the law? She did not have to defend herself. Alaric's gaze shifted from her face back to Albright. The cold in the room intensified. The flames in the hearth seemed to leap higher, casting dancing, distorted shadows on the walls. "You claim she has no skill," Alaric said, his voice dangerously soft. "That she is a soulless copyist." "She is," Albright spat, "a mimic, nothing more." Alaric made a small, elegant gesture toward a side table. On it, under a velvet cloth, lay a large, leather-bound book. "A few months ago," he said, his voice resonating through the hall. I came into possession of a unique text, the personal journal of Lorenzo de' Medici, believed lost for 400 years. It was in a lamentable state, water-damaged, the binding shattered, the ink faded almost to invisibility. He looked at Sable. My custodian offered to restore it. He then turned his gaze back to Albright, a predator toying with its prey. She worked on it here, in this hall, for 2 months. When she was finished, I sent a single restored page to the acquisitions department at the University of Padua, along with a sample of its original condition. He reached into his coat and produced a thick letter, its seal a deep crimson wax. This arrived by special courier this morning. He did not open it. He simply held it. It is a formal offer from the university. They are creating a new position, head of the Department for Manuscript Restoration. They are offering it to the artisan responsible for what they call a miracle of restoration, a work not of mere craft, but of unparalleled genius and historical empathy. He let the words hang in the silent hall. Albright's face went from ruddy to pale. Alaric took a slow step toward him. The shadows at his feet writhed and coiled. You, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more menacing than any shout, are the one with no soul. You stood in the presence of genius and saw only a servant. You dismissed a gift because you were too small to recognize it. You are a fraud. Now, Alaric continued, his voice hardening into a command, you will apologize to her, and then you will leave my lands and never return. Albright was trembling, his eyes darting between Alaric's predatory stillness and the unnatural movement of the shadows. The magistrate, sweating profusely, began to back away toward the door. I, Albright stammered, but no apology came. Greed and hatred were still warring with his terror. Alaric's patience, thin as it was, snapped. He did not move, but the darkness in the room did. The shadows detached from the corners and flowed across the floor like spilled ink. They swirled around Albright and Henderson's feet, cold and substantial. The two men cried out in pure, primal terror. They turned and fled, stumbling over each other in their haste to escape the impossible, grasping dark. The great doors slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing through the now silent hall. The shadows receded, melting back into the corners. The oppressive cold vanished. There was only the warmth of the fire, and the two of them. Sable was shaking, not from fear, but from the overwhelming force of his defense. He had not just protected her. He had vindicated her. In front of the very man who had wounded her, he had declared her a genius. He had given her back her name, her pride, her art. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Thank you, she whispered. He came to her, closing the distance between them. He gently took the dusting cloth from her nerveless fingers and set it aside. The offer from the university is real, he said softly. Padua is beautiful in the spring. You would be celebrated, respected. You would have everything you deserve. Her heart clenched. Was he sending her away? I do not want you to take it, he continued, his crimson eyes searching her face. I am asking you to stay. He took her hands in his. His skin was cool but not cold. It was the temperature of life, not of ice. When you first lit this fire, he said, his voice raw with an emotion she had never heard from him before, I told myself it was for the curse, that I needed you to keep the cold at bay. It was a lie I told myself. The fire is not the warmth in this house, Sable. You are. He was the ancient, powerful vampire king, a creature of legend and terror. And in that moment, he was utterly vulnerable. Stay with me, he pleaded, his voice barely a whisper. Not as a custodian, not as a guest, as the chatelaine of this house, as its heart. Stay with me as my partner, my equal. Tears finally spilled over, tracing clean paths through the faint smudges of dust on her cheeks. She had come to Blackwood Manor a ghost, an overlooked girl with nowhere to go, and here, in the heart of darkness, she had been found. She had been seen. She tightened her grip on his hands. I will stay, she said, her voice full of a joy so profound it was almost painful. Time passed, not in days or weeks, but in seasons, turning one into the other. The grand hall of Blackwood Manor was never cold again. The fire in the great hearth never went out. It burned brightly, a constant, cheerful heart in the center of the house. Sable did not go to Padua, but her name became known in those circles all the same. Alaric, working from the shadows with his immense wealth and influence, ensured that her work was seen. He anonymously submitted her restorations to museums and universities, creating a legend around the mysterious, brilliant artisan known only as Sable. The name Mr. Albright had once spat as an insult became a mark of genius. She was no longer the keeper of the flame. She was the Lady of Blackwood. She moved through the house not as a servant, but as its mistress. The staff, who had once feared her, now adored her. She had brought not just warmth, but life and laughter back into the ancient, sorrowful halls. One autumn evening, several years after the confrontation with Albright, they were sitting together by the fire. Not with him in his shadowy chair and her at her work table, but together on a comfortable sofa drawn close to the hearth. A book lay open in her lap, but she was not reading. She was watching his face in the firelight. He had changed. The harsh, frozen beauty of his features had softened. The perpetual winter in his eyes had thawed, leaving behind a deep, quiet melancholy that was now warmed by a gentle affection whenever he looked at her. You are thinking, he said softly, his fingers tracing the pattern on the velvet sofa. I was thinking about time, she confessed. About the pages of this book, how they yellow and grow brittle, how everything mortal fades. She was touching on the one subject they had never spoken of directly, her mortality, the finite, fragile span of her life against the endless, unchanging river of his. He grew very still. He turned to face her fully, taking her hand. Sable, he said, his voice serious. That choice will always be yours. Only yours. I have lived through ages of loneliness. I would not trade a single day of the life you have now, a single day of your warmth and your laughter, for an eternity of you trapped in my world against your will. He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, his lips cool but gentle. When and if you are ready to share my long night, you have only to ask. Until then, I will treasure every sunrise that I must miss, because I know you are seeing it. It was the greatest gift he could have given her. Not immortality, but the freedom to choose. The freedom to live her own precious life, knowing she was loved completely, for exactly as long as it was meant to last. She smiled, a slow, radiant smile that lit up her face. I once thought my greatest work was restoring books, she said, her voice soft. But I was wrong. She reached up and gently touched his cheek. My greatest work was restoring this house to a home. He leaned into her touch, his crimson eyes, now the color of warm rubies in the firelight, closing for a moment. He breathed in her scent of old paper and soap, and the faint, clean smell of her skin. She was his warmth, his anchor, his home. He opened his eyes and looked at her, truly seeing her, as he had from the very first moment. Sable, he whispered. And it was not just a name. It was a prayer. It was everything. For more stories where quiet compassion conquers centuries of cold, and where being truly seen becomes the greatest transformation of all, subscribe to Herb Files. So tell me, would you have stayed? Comment where you are listening from tonight. I stay up until my eyes burn to bring you these stories. If this one touched you, do not break my heart. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one.